Yeah, right, Walter.
Right, well, here we are. Right, see, 30 seconds to go.
I know. I wanted you all to myself for a while.
We're punctual, like beyond punctual.
Yeah, well, one thing. There's all kinds of questions, but maybe we have it as a little. I'm just curious about the status of the land ecosystems in Australia, the drylands of Australia, which is most of it. Are things getting worse and worse, or have things sort of started getting better and better? Or are they sort of equal? Because I know both forces are at work. Things getting better, some ecosystems and things. But what's the overall trend?
Well, look, overall, Michael, and I was going to talk about it, but basically overall, no, it's getting worse. It's aridifying, right? So it's water that's the critical situation. Australia, driest inhabited continent. And we get an average of 450, or used to get an average of 450 millimeters a year. That's about 14 inches, right? And that's sort of dropping. And so in some parts, we're expecting a 30% drop in rainfall. Okay, so we're getting down pretty Nevada, that type of dry country, right?
Yeah.
And so, look, yes, it's getting worse, but it's also more serious because it's getting very, very much more extreme and variable. So you can't predict anything anymore, right? Whereas before you'd be a dryland farmer and you'd say, look, 4 years out of 5, I can work with the seasons. And even if I've got not massive yields, I've got reliability. Whereas now there's none of that reliability is there, right? So it's getting quite serious. So on that side, very negative. But what I wanted to talk about very much are the positives. So really, there are some really unique things about Australia. And it's really, can we listen and learn and understand those? And then can we use them to redesign and regenerate a much more resilient biosystem in Australia? And the answer is, of course, yes, we can. But that's the big challenge, right? And it's really now this transition from the conventional industrial agriculture land management where we had predictability and people thought they knew, right? And now we're saying, how do we redesign much more intelligent, natural, ecological cycles and systems that are more resilient, adaptive, buffered to actually accommodate these extremes? So it's really quite serious, very serious, but also quite exciting time because we have this opportunity, if we can understand and bring these ideas together, to make that change. And that's where permaculture is really quite powerful and important because really it starts from the foundation of saying, okay, how do we understand biosystems? How do we look at the processes that govern them? How does nature operate in these environments? And what can we do to actually rebuild those natural processes and thereby resilient buffered biosystems? So, look, permaculture is right at the front. Now, I mean, not that it's accepted as the real thing, but it will be a key part of the solution, understanding those natural processes and then applying them intelligently. Bit of background as far as myself, you see, I started off as a scientist, a research scientist, soil microbiology, plant diseases. This is way back in the 70s. But then very much got involved with, of course, this guy, Mr. Bill Mollison. You've all got his book, have you?
All right, yeah,
the Designer's Manual. Yeah, well, we spent a lot of time writing this.
Uh-huh.
Okay, but the point is, you see, you've got one too.
Oh yeah, I got two, but I just sold one.
Oh, okay. But the point is that, and so that whole idea of, look, here are the natural processes. And in a sense, what Bill Mollison sort of very much did is saying, look, okay, can I document these? Can I just collate them, right? Bring them all together and then really use them as a toolkit to both understand, but then also look at redesigning opportunities, redesigning processes to address limiting factors. So it's actually a very important time because, I mean, obviously Bill was doing this for the last 40 years, but now the need for that sort of practical, nature-based redesign has become critically important.
So,
yeah, and so you're going, so.
oh, I was just gonna. Someone just handed me my permaculture book. They made one. It's the same book, but they gave it a new title, a new publisher.
Yep.
They kind of cut out. Anyway,
I've got a
bit of
copy of
politics
yours.
of that too.
This is the original, right? This is
Oh,
the
I got that
original.
one. I got Mike's signed copy from Bill. Yeah, but
Okay.
that's all right. You're part of the club for sure. I didn't know if you were way permaculture or not.
Oh yeah, look, no, I was involved. Well, Bill used to come and stay with me in Brisbane, and we basically were putting a lot of that tropical agriculture ecology together. But at the time, this is in the late 70s, we were basically putting together, and then this is really the compilation of all that he learned all over the world, right? He spent a lot of time going around to different environments and just picking up the local wisdom, very much often the First Nations wisdoms. What is it that they had understood? So it's quite a valuable sort of source book toolkit now for the future. So hold on to your copies. They're going to be more and more valuable, right?
That's right.
The problem is the bindings are terrible.
I know the Canadian bindings. The Australian bindings were wherever that was. This was a better binding, but you know what? The information is the same. I'm going to keep even when mine falls apart, I will keep it. It's never going to, maybe I'll request it to bury it with me.
No, pass it on. But the point is that, okay, but
I'll give it to my son. Okay, better.
Things have moved on, and so now it's a case of where are the case studies, where are the applications, where have we documented, yes, this is working here, that's working there, and all the time taking these processes and making them more effective. But look, the bottom line is, as I was just saying, Australia is the driest inhabited continent, some of the oldest leach soils, and of course we are in the front line in a way globally of this aridification and climate extremes. And so a lot of people are pretty despairing, right? They sort of say, hang on, this is getting pretty grim. But then again, being Australians, we take the attitude, if you haven't got a chance, you might as well use it, right?
Good.
Okay, because the answer is you got nothing to lose. And then if you start looking at the system, it's really quite exquisite because nature has taken exactly that proposition, right? I've got these very dry habitats. I've got this very, very leached old soils. So how do I vegetate it? And over the last 46 million years, nature has been exquisitely efficient at designing, evolving germplasm, microbes, fungi, plants, systems to actually accommodate in this extreme environment, right? And so we've basically, through that evolution, or nature, through that evolution, has basically created actually a very resilient, unique biosystem, very much down under, very much in the soil microbiology, where all the guts, the operational thing is. So while we've got a lot of deserts that are dry as anywhere else, 95% of our deserts are still green. They're still vegetated. So we've got these, green deserts, right? Which means that, look, nature has solved these problems. And it's really us now looking at those green deserts, the plants that are surviving there, to say, well, how do they do it? And can we understand those processes and apply them now in our agriculture or in a redesigned future permaculture? And that's a really enormous opportunity. So Australia has these natural adaptations, these unique germplasms, and a lot of that comes down to, in a sense, my area, soil microbiology, right? It's the things in the soil, which really comes down to the guts of it all, which is really the Earth's soil carbon sponge. right? It's really that sponge, that carbon sponge, which in a sense nature used 420 million years ago. It was just oceans and dry, bare rock. And again, it was nature using fungi, colonizing that rock, solubilizing the rock, leaving behind organic detritus that actually created the first soils. That organic matter that was left between the mineral detritus was then able to hold water, make nutrients more available, allow roots to penetrate, and then very rapidly, pedogenesis, that soil development process, is in a sense what enabled nature to colonize all the land on this planet. So within the Carboniferous Permian, within 100 million years, all the land turned from bare, hard, dry rock to forested biosystems. 14 billion hectares of productive forested biosystems, now all rehydrated, all basically productive from that starting point of bare, dry rock. And of course, we're now having to face the same challenge. Okay, what are we going to do with our desertified, aridified landscapes? And how do we use these accelerated natural processes to actually regenerate, and then by regenerating, rehydrate them? Again, very powerful. We've got to change our whole perspective of water. We always say, hang on, we haven't got the rain, therefore we've got a desert. Quite the other way around. If we have vegetation, we have rain. You see, we can generate the whole water cycle, the hydrology, the rainfall through vegetation. Again, quite a profound change of mind, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so these are the sort of concepts that, in a sense, we can see in Australia and we can see in these arid lands. And now we say, how do we use them to rebuild initially the Earth's soil carbon sponge, and through that rebuild its hydrology, and through that, of course, rebuild productive biosystems. So even if we've only got 100 millimeters, 4 inches of rainfall, which is getting pretty dry, here are productive biosystems. We've got grain farmers, leading innovators in Western Australia, on 6 to 8 inches of rainfall. And yeah, they're putting crops in and getting 2 tons per hectare of grain out of that system in a very ecological, sustainable way. So you see, these are the things, can we use these natural processes to do that? And so that's really what the whole challenge for the 21st century is, right? Because you see, we've now got 5 billion hectares of man-made desert and wasteland on this planet. There's only 14 billion hectares of land on the whole Earth's surface. And in the last 10,000 years, we've converted 40% of it, 5 billion hectares, into man-made desert and wasteland. And it's that desert and wasteland which is really the frontier, because instead of just adding to it, degrading, oxidizing soils, turning more of it into wasteland, can we actually turn 1 billion hectares of that wasteland, of the 5, back into productive biosystems? And that's really an exciting opportunity. And the answer is yes, we can do it. And so what I'd like to go through now is a little bit of, what is it that, in a sense, we can do to actually turn 1 billion hectares of the world's aridified wastelands. These are wastelands that, at the start of the Holocene, 10,000 years ago, were vegetated and productive, whether it was the Sahara, the Middle East, China, Australia, India, all these deserts that we now have were vegetated. So how did they function 10,000 years ago? What have we done to them? And how do we turn it around?
Well, I totally agree with you there, Walter. And I was thinking, as the vegetation that's evolved in Australia is so specialized and unique to be able to do that. But I would say that every dryland part of the world has their suite of species that have been that developed there that could fill the function. And we might have to, in a drying environment. In our area, we have grasslands that shift to semi-arid shrub steppe if it gets too dry. So we do have vegetational changes across the landscape, and so we might have to do some designing with that in mind to help that the best suited suite of species be there.
Right, exactly, Michael. But I'd like to take it one step down under, because it's not the species above the ground alone. It's actually what's happening in the soil, in that sponge, because it's the sponge that it becomes our point of agency on this planet.
Hallelujah.
Very important. You know, like the only point of agency we have as humans on this planet, for good or worse, is what do we do to the Earth's soil carbon sponge? Do we oxidize it and turn it all back into CO2, which is, of course, what we're experiencing with the CO2 rise, climate change, you know, centuries of oxidation of the carbon from the soils, putting that CO2 in the air. Fossil fuels, of course, have added to it in the last 70 years, but it's only a small fraction. We can come into that. So do we oxidize it and desertify, or do we actually biosequester it in the sponge and then use the sponge as our only point of human agency on the planet? Now, that's how nature created the biosystem, but really that's the only leverage point that we've got. What are we doing to our soil carbon sponge? And if we can manage that, then yes, vegetation follows. And after the vegetation, hydrology follows. Okay, so look, I just wanted to now, I'll just turn the slide around so you can see this little diagram. Now, can you see, have you got it all in your screen now?
Yeah,
This
it looks
little
good.
shot?
Yep.
Looks good. Okay, and it all starts very...
Oh, we need a little more top, they say. Hold on, Walter. They say lower it a little bit. Need a little more top.
A little more top.
There we go. There. That's good. Now I think you got it there.
Oh, hang on. Yeah, but hang on. Is that right?
A little bit more left. Just our left, but needs to go another. Yeah. Are we good? Good.
Yeah.
Stop.
Okay. Well, look, actually, I can go back a bit and then you should get all of it in easier. Yeah. So, look, the bottom line, this is about 100 raindrops, right? And the very simple proposition, wherever you are on the planet, you get rain. And so the issue isn't amount. The real issue isn't how much rain do you get. Obviously, the more it's better. But the real question I'm asking here is what happens to every one of 100 raindrops that we do get? Okay, so don't ask for more, but what are we doing with what we've got? And this is basically based on the Australian Murray-Darling Basin. It's about 100 million hectares, but it's equivalent to your Central Valley in California, but it's also typical globally. So while the percentages may vary slightly from place to place, the whole picture is much the same. And what it says, we get 100 raindrops falling, and obviously most of it falls on land. And then what happens is that some 12 drops out of 100 go into our streams, but 86 drops out of 100 fall onto our soils. And basically what we've done is, right, we've got water in streams, 2 out of 100 drops end up in our dams, and we've spent trillions of dollars through the World Bank, UN, etc., building 50,000 large dams all over the place. And of course, the Western United States knows this very well. But that holds 2 out of 100 of the raindrops that fall on most lands. But we've relied now on these dams, these 2 out of 100, to basically meet our water needs. 70% of that goes into agriculture on average. 20% goes into industry, including energy, cooling processes, and about 10% is urban water use. And of course, we're facing, and the World Meteorological Organization just a couple of days ago raised it again, we're facing a water crisis because this 2 drops out of 100 in our dams is running out. We haven't got enough. Everywhere it's drying. But what we tend to ignore is that, look, 86 drops out of 100 fell on our soils. And it's what happens to the water in our soils that is really the critical issue. And in our current degraded situation in Australia, but this is Central Valley, everywhere it'd be much the same, some 36 out of the 86 might end up as transpiration, used by plants and biomass to actually grow green. But over 50 drops out of the 100 basically either evaporate or run off to the sea. Okay, so what it's saying is that we've effectively concreted our catchments. And the last 100 years of industrial import, we have literally just concreted catchments to the extent that we're wasting 50 drops out of 100, more or less through evaporation and just runoff, flood runoff to the sea. And this is powerful because that's 25 times the water in our dams. Okay? And so if we want to say, look, how do we rehydrate, regenerate? How do we use water more wisely? How do we secure our future? It's all about saying, okay, we've got this water in the soil, and can I get more of that water in the soil carbon sponge, to basically build biomass and then hydrologically cool the climate, but also sustain biosystems. So whereas we've got a crisis, and of course we're hearing all about that, we also have this exquisite solution. We've got 25 times, 2,500% response capacity of extra water if we can stop this evaporative loss and just store it in our sponge. And of course, this is exactly what nature did. Now, I'll go to the next little slide because this comes into petagenesis. And again, it makes a very simple situation of, well, what is a sponge and how does it form? And it's very simple because we started off, of course, when we just had rock on this planet. This is 420 million years ago, if you like. And rock's got a bulk density 2.6 to 3.5 grams per cc, depending on if it's a sedimentary or igneous rock. But the bottom line is there's no aeration, there's no water holding capacity, there's no nutrient access, there's no root access, and microbially it's basically dead. It's just dead mineral rock. And in a sense, what nature did by growing fungi and then colonizing this rock and dissolving it slowly, and it left behind organic detritus, which I've just reflected here in little red garbage between the mineral particles. And so basically by putting organic detritus in the rock, it was able to sort of progressively increase the aeration. So when we get to 3% organic matter in this rock matrix, we end up, in a sense, with this sponge. And now we find that the bulk density of this soil, this sponge, has a bulk density of, on average, 1.2 grams per cc. And that tells us straight away, obviously physics, that over 50% of the void in this matrix now is just air. It's nothing. By putting this organic, spongy material between the mineral particles, we've actually created a sponge, 50% of which is air. And of course, that void, those voids can now hold water. So it's got a potential water holding capacity, again, of over 50% of the volume. Because you've exposed all these mineral surfaces, you've now got this a massive surface increase in nutrient availability. And that gives you an immediate dividend in terms of biofertility. So you haven't added any nutrients, you haven't changed the mineral composition, but you've made these surfaces more available. And of course, that availability combined with microbial activity gives you biofertility. So we're raising the biofertility of these soils simply by making them more open, looser, more accessible. Obviously, logically, you can expect root access in this medium to be high. So whereas when you had a compacted soil, roots will grow down to 8 inches if you're lucky. Whereas here you've got roots, as in your prairies, etc., that'll grow down to 3-4 meters, 10 feet. And the same goes for the microbial activity, whereas before it was basically dead, inert mineral material. Now you've got this whole habitat for extremely, extremely productive microbial activity cycling. So in a sense, what this is saying, we have gone from, in a sense, rock in fertile mineral substrate into healthy soils. And all we've done is actually add nothing. Okay, when people ask you then, how do I make healthy soils? You simply say, yeah, you add nothing. But the only way you can add nothing is to build the carbon sponge, to build that three-dimensional. You can draw these as little bed springs. And so then you've created the sponge and you've actually sort of turned this bulk density of up to 3.5 into 1.2. And that gives you the evidence that you've created the sponge. And so this is how nature, this is petagenesis, and this is how nature very, very simply, for the first time 420 million years ago, but ever time since, I mean, if you look at the ice ages, start of the Holocene, 10,000 years ago, we had glacial till and rock and outwash and clay and detritus. And it is just simply by adding carbon into these soil structures and then adding nothing, just adding air, that you end up with healthy soils. And so this process of petagenesis fundamentally transforms the productivity of these landscapes. And in permaculture, in a sense, that's what, when you break it all down, that's what we're trying to do down under. We're trying to simply say, how do we create healthier, well-structured soil with water holding capacity, nutrient availability, root access, microbial cycling, and we all can do it all by adding the sponge. Okay, Michael? Now, what we've done... Sorry, go on.
That all sounds good. You're doing great there, Walter.
Okay, and what we've done in agriculture, of course, this is this era coming back. We've had now sort of basically full ball since the Second World War, 70 years of industrial agriculture. We call it more on agriculture because we're always putting more on. You got to spell it the right way, of course, very important. More on agriculture. But be careful how you word it, right? Spell it. Anyway, but basically that's been in the business of oxidizing this carbon from the soils, right? Yeah. So because we're adding we're cultivating, we're burning, we're over-fertilizing, adding biocides, bare fallowing, all of these oxidative processes have basically brought our soil, natural soil, from some 3%, and on average now our rangeland soils are 0.3% carbon or less. Okay, and it's really this carbon that we've put up into the air as CO2. But now we're left with, in a sense, this degraded, more compacted soil. The soils have gone from 1.2 to about 1.8 grams per cc. They're more compacted, haven't got the aeration, and of course they're losing water, they're losing productivity, etc. So when I was talking about the 100 drops before, you see, we've more or less now working in this level. We're saying, look, we're working with these minimal structured soils, all the water's running off. But basically nature avoided all that by being up here at 3% carbon. And because of that, was able to infiltrate 90 out of the 100 raindrops in the soil, which would then be stored in the in-soil reservoirs. And of course, from the in-soil reservoirs would be actually feeding springs and streams from subsoil recharge. And so by simply creating this soil structure, we totally change the hydrology of that landscape. We totally change it even with the same 100 raindrops.
So
now, this is profound because as we get into climate change, and you know it now in Western US, we know it in Australia, you're going to get perhaps 30% fewer raindrops. You're going to have to say, I'm going to have to do in the Central Valley without snowpack, and I'm going to get 30% less reliable rain. So how am I going to grow with 70 raindrops rather than 100? And the only way you can do it to say, look, if I'm on this situation, I'm only getting 70 raindrops that out of the 100 that I used to get, you're dead, right? You're finished. It's back to a desert. Whereas the only option is to say, look, how do I rebuild that healthy, well-structured soil? Because then I can hold every one of those 70 raindrops, but I'm also getting this force multiplier benefit because I'm actually storing and retaining, making them available and building bioproductivity because of that sponge.
Okay, so Walter, that's all really clear. So my next, the obvious question for us is how do we build that soil sponge? By putting in a lot more of the native plants that
right?
Can survive there, and increasing the biomass by putting, by.
Yep. No. Look, okay.
No, what's the next step?
Okay. Well, okay. I've got a couple of things to talk about before we get to the next step, how to do it. But the point is, it's that simple, isn't it? How do we go back from 0.3 to 3%? And when you think of it, it's no big deal. We're just adding some organic matter into the soil. But obviously it can't just be I'm just adding things on the surface. It's got to be structured in this way. We'll talk about that. I just wanted to put this next slide up, really, which is, again, trying to make the explanation why this is so important. And this is a simple hydrograph, right? All the engineers understand hydrographs perfectly. And basically, it's a question of the flow rate over time under different sort of storm events. So if we say we have a 2-inch rainfall storm event, just say, look at Central Valley, California, we've got a 2-inch storm event. And basically, if we've got a soil with 0.3% carbon, it's pretty oxidized and compacted, we know we've got a flood peak, don't we? We end up with this massive, rapid flood peak of runoff from the land. And of course, once it's run off, it'll drop and it'll just drop down. So there's a red line, which is our flood peak profile when we've got a degraded soil. And obviously what we've got then, we've got a flood, no question. We've got erosion because that volume of water is enormous. We've got enormous loss, risk, and cost. Cost, for example, because we got to build concrete storm water infrastructure everywhere. We're sinking literally billions of dollars into storm mitigation, concrete, civil engineering infrastructure. So this is really the world we're living in. How do we actually concrete the catchment and then have these consequences of that? But what we don't tend to recognize is the minute we do this, we by definition design in the next step, which is a drought, because obviously here's a flood. Well, the drought is I haven't got water, therefore I'm in a drought. And so because you've lost all the water, you've got it by definition a drought. You've got more erosion, you've got more deaths and going to desert because you've lost the whole system. But again, you've got more risk and you've got more costs because now you're in a drought. And so we've got in this stupid situation where we've basically designed in, not deliberately, but through our hubris, we've designed in this aridification and drought. And we're actually turning country that was highly productive effectively into desert. So if you look again, Central Valley, when the Spanish came there 400 years ago, it was all verdant wetlands, beautiful sort of spongy wetlands, and it was a paradise, a Garden of Eden. And then progressively, we've now taken it. We've relied on irrigation, of course, but the point is once that stops, the whole thing becomes basically desert. And of course, this is now the situation that our agriculture is in. And so really coming back to our previous slide, what we've got to do is we've got to say, look, how do we actually increase the carbon content of those soils? And if we do, then we end up with a completely different hydrograph, because the same 2-inch storm event now will create a flood peak which will follow the green line. Same volume of water, same rain, but basically it will basically soak into the sponge, be retained in the in-soil reservoirs. And basically, yes, there will be some runoff because now soil carbon is at 3%. So this hatched area there will run off compared to the red area. But the really powerful thing that will happen, and this is again what we don't recognize, the really powerful thing is it's all that water stored in these in-soil reservoirs below this runoff, which gives us longevity of green growth. Okay, longevity of green growth. And this is extremely important because this is what gives us productivity, resilience, and all the savings that were costing us here. Now, let me explain. It's a question of how long are plants growing for. So it's not a question I've got the toughest plant or I've got the genetically engineered best plant, because a plant can grow can do so much photosynthesis per unit area per day. And we can play around with all the genetics there and we might get a 30% improvement, right? So when I was a scientist, if we could get a 30% growth response to fertilizer or biocides or breeding, we'd be excited, right? Whereas here, by longevity of green growth, we can increase productivities literally by 1,000%, 2,000% by extending the number of days that plant has water and is able to grow. Okay, and that's just logical because now the plant is able to keep on growing instead of basically growing for 5 days after the rainfall event and then it's dry again, here it is growing for 100 days after the rainfall event. That's a 20-fold extension and longevity of growth. That's a 2,000% growth response. Okay, and we've basically in our industrial agriculture always selected for plants that can grow bigger, faster, but we've completely ignored this factor of length, time. And it's really time that's the biggest force multiplier we have in this game, resilience and time. So it's productivity, but of course, if it's there for longer, it's got resilience. It can survive. It can keep on growing. And so deserts are basically plants that have adapted in this system and they have longevity, they have staying power, they have resilience, they survive. And in this game of nature, as in business, it's the winner that takes all, right? Because if you can survive, if you're there, then when the next rain comes, you can exploit all of that. Whereas all these, very fast growing, vulnerable industrial plants, they've died off long ago. Okay, so this is a completely different perspective on productivity, resilience, and what we have to now get to, because permaculture, as the world goes drier, as water becomes the key limiting factor, we've got to redesign ecosystems to work on these in-soil reservoirs, and then extending the longevity of green growth of those reservoirs. So very, very powerful. So it's not just a matter of we've increased soil carbon. Hey, that's good. But this is really illustrating the powerful dividends that we get from that increased soil carbon in terms of the hydrology of that landscape.
Hear, hear.
Right. Now, I mean, it's a question of, I mean, I might go through this a little bit more quickly because the point is that there's a whole lot of water saving issues and what have you that nature uses as part of this. And I'll go through it very quickly, though, because I really wanted to get more into the discussion, which is probably where the more bigger dividends is. But see, in nature too, we've got a completely different ecology of water uptake. 98% of plants in nature, of course, have got these mycorrhizal symbioses. You know, it's the actual microbial life down under. And these mycorrhizal symbioses, they form extensive networks of hyphae throughout the soil, extending the root systems. I've done a lot of work in this area, and up to 25,000 kilometers of fungal hyphae per cubic meter of healthy soil. That's twice the diameter of the earth per cubic meter of these fungal hyphae. And of course, they proliferate all throughout the soil and across the surfaces of all these sand grains. And of course, they're taking up water from these surface films at water tensions way below the wilting point of plants. Okay, and so this is now another whole dimension in arid zone rehydration, land management. Because if we have these mycorrhizal symbioses on our plants, then the concept of wilting point that we established in plant physiology, you know, that a plant can take up water from a soil up to this tension, goes out the window, because we're now talking about the actual water uptake capacity of these mycorrhizal membranes in association with water films, and they can be 10 times the tensions that plants can no longer take up water from soils. Compared to that, if we go into the industrial hydroponic setup, where we have killed all these mycorrhizal interfaces, then the water can only be taken up effectively by the roots through suction, and that water can only be taken up from the actual soil solution water that is between the sort of particles, but not from the films of water around the particles. So this is where the wilting point concept comes in. If we only have roots, then we've perhaps only got access to 10% of the water that these mycorrhizal fungi have. Okay, so here's another natural ecological system. Nature doesn't rely on just hydroponic roots. Nature has these microbial extensions of root systems, but most importantly, an extension of the capacity to take up water from these soil surfaces, these soil films. And in an arid environment, in a dry season, this is absolutely critically important in allowing these plants to survive. So again, a good permaculture design, we're designing plants with these microbial ecologies. So all that issue of whereas the industrial plants are wilting and dying, these things are surviving, is completely consistent with what happens in nature. So very, very powerful. Another thing that we're using now, this is coming partly permaculture, partly into urban agriculture, that is actually very important, is looking at the water use efficiency. And we've got this concept called wicking bags, or they can be pots, but basically it's really significant because at the moment in most of our agriculture, we're wasting 90% of the water because that water leaks and leaches below the root zone of our crop plants, and of course gets into the subsoils and what have you. But most of the water that's supplied in irrigation is actually lost. Conversely, we've got tree roots and what have you competing with our cropping soils. And of course, they're getting 90% of the water because they're far more competitive, as we've shown in that previous slide, because they've got these mycorrhizal interfaces. So we've got this potential to increase our water use efficiency for crops or for agricultural plants tenfold, a tenfold, 1,000% increase in water use efficiency by saying, can we actually stop this water leaching and getting lost? And of course, can we stop the competition of other native tree roots from taking this water and starving the plants? And this is critical, for example, in village agriculture, Africa, where ladies are collecting water, and they've got very limited water, but their crops that they're trying to grow to feed themselves and their children are basically desiccated because 90% of that water is getting lost. And so these wicking bag systems actually, because they're really just a container, in the base of the container, we've got this basically a little aquifer in a way. We've created a plastic-lined pillow, and we're requiring all these roots to get their water from capillary action from this layer below. We can actually recharge that layer below with grey water, from subsoil irrigation. But basically, for cropping systems, urban agriculture, we're using 100% of the water that we're adding is being used to grow these crop plants. And so this is actually a tenfold dividend that we can put into growing food plants rather than losing all this water. And this is critical in a lot of arid regions because we'd like to grow food plants, but we don't have the water to grow them. It takes about 1,000 mils of water to grow 1 gram of biomass, right? It's 1,000 to 1, the water use compared to conventional agricultural crop yields, 1,000 to 1. And basically, we can reduce that enormously by not losing all this water. So we can get down to 50 to 1, 100 to 1. Obviously, the plants still need water. They're still going to transpire water, but we've got a tenfold water use efficiency capacity for these food growing systems. So this is another critically important role of how do we actually have, better water use in dryland situations. We've also got another whole dimension of actually how do we harvest water from the air. Now, this is quite freaky, isn't it? Because we always think of, rain comes from the air, but we forget that the air contains up to 50,000 parts per million of water vapor in the air. So 5% of the weight of the air, up to 5% of the weight of the air, is in fact water vapor, is water. And of course, natural plant systems harvest this water. So if you're in Arizona, your cacti are harvesting this water from the air. Okay, then there's been no rainfall, but they're basically growing there. They're succulent, they're fully hydrated. And why? Because every night they're getting 1 to 2 millimeters of water, harvesting water from this aerial flow. And of course, we've got the same thing in Australia. We've got, for example, salt bushes growing in range areas which get 100 millimeters, 4 inches of rainfall a year. But we've got this very verdant, beautiful saltbush vegetation because, again, the salt bushes are harvesting water from the air. So we've got these rivers of water flowing across the whole planet continually, including all the world's deserts, up to 50,000 parts per million, 5% by weight, but mostly, of course, it's just flowing over them. It's not being harvested. So the question is, how do we help harvest this? And again, this is where permaculture comes in, because if we're looking at now ridge plantings, for examples, then we can get this beautiful effect. And you get this, again, beautifully in California, where, for example, you have the Sierra Nevadas. And so as basically the humid air has to rise over the mountain, it builds up high pressure because of that air is having to rise over these mountains. But as soon as it goes over the crest of the mountain range, then it goes into an area of low pressure, okay? Because now obviously it's been pressured up, and now we've got, because of topography, we've got lower pressure. And as the air gets into lower pressure, it can't hold as much water, okay? It can't retain that much water. And so it has to condense that water. And that's where you then get, again, people are using it, these fog nests, or we're having water harvesting structures. But of course, nature didn't have to bother with nets because it would grow vegetation in these habitats. And some of that vegetation was exquisitely designed for harvesting this water in the air, harvesting water in the air. And so, Cupressus arizonica, for example, the shape of the foliage, the phyllodes and what have you are just exquisitely designed for condensing water and bringing water from the air into that soil. We have the same thing, of course, on your coastal sequoia forests, or even on the Sierra Nevada, the Sequoia giganteum, the giant redwoods. Up to 70% of their water comes from fog harvesting, mist harvesting, aerial harvesting through the conformation of their leaf, the way their leaves are designed, and then used as, in a sense, condensation surfaces for harvesting this water from the air. Actually, the Celts actually took this one step further because, and again, it's all in literature, but it goes back 4,000 years, so it's quite stunning, because they built dew ponds at the top of these ridges. So they would sort of build, here's a top of a ridge, here's a bit of a saddle in the ridge, and they would build a dew pond in that ridge, which was really just an insulated 15-meter roughly diameter conical pond. But this would be, because it was insulated, have very, very cold water. And again, that cold water then operated as a condensation surface. And of course, these then were continually recharged, these dew ponds, by the water condensing every night as it flowed over these ridges. And of course, that was exquisitely valuable because this was now stock water at the top of the ridges. And of course, all the animals, the sheep and what have you, they would sort of basically at nighttime move up the ridges because this is where it was warmer. You had frost hollows and cold air down here. It was warmer here, but they would be up here. And of course, this is where they had their water from these dew ponds. And you can still see them now. There's natural wetlands, at the top of mountain ridges like this. And of course, that was, again, very powerful because the animals would bring nutrients from the lower grounds, bring them up to the mountains every night, have their drink, excrete all their nutrients and stuff in their excrement, and of course, then fertilize the whole slope. These dew ponds were also very powerful because they, through hydrostatic pressure in the soil, basically recharged that whole slope. So again, you had infiltration at the dew pond, and then that would basically, through hydrostatic pressure, move right down. It might break out at springs at certain points, but the point is it would recharge that whole slope. So here we had, in a sense, water from the air, the rivers from the air being harvested, put into these dew pond, and then rehydrating and recharging that whole slope. So very, very exquisite, efficient hydrological systems, and again, operated in deserts all over the planet. If you go to the Atacama Desert in Chile, a little town called Antofagasta, the Spanish were there for, again, over 400 years. Every morning they went out to look, is there any rain in the tin can, the rain gauge I get? and they walk in and sort of write a big 0 and say, no rain now. We've had 380 years of no rain. But behind Antofagasta, there used to be a prosopis forest, beautiful, tall prosopis forest. And again, this prosopis forest just harvested all its water from these aerial airflows. Okay, so we don't get rain necessarily, but that doesn't mean there isn't water that we can harvest and we can use. This goes a little bit further. Another hydrological concept that's pretty powerful, and again, permaculture, these are the tools that we can use, these water processes. It's called the biotic pump, or what drives monsoonal rainfall. So this is now on a slightly larger landscape scale. But of course, what happens, we've got the oceans, and of course, that's evaporating moisture, moisture to drive this whole area, rivers in the air. But really what matters is basically what happens over land. And actually, we've got two contrasting systems, because if we have bare, dry, hot land, it will absorb a lot of sun incident solar radiation, and it'll get up to 60 degrees centigrade or more, get very, very hot. And of course, it's again simple physics, Stefan Boltzmann physics. Whenever it gets hot, it re-radiates massive amount of heat back up into the air. And this creates, again, a high pressure heat dome over these bare, dry areas. And this high pressure heat, of course, is just sitting on these areas as a heat dome effectively, and actually is not raining, it's just getting hotter and hotter. Now, by contrast, if we have basically vegetated landscapes, same next door, it can be the same, initially the same rainfall, I'll explain, I'll get more later, but it's the same rainfall, but because basically these plants are transpiring, and with that, they're actually taking energy from the surface for latent heat of vaporization, and they're transpiring that water. And so because they're protecting that soil and transpiring, they're keeping that land cool. And generally a vegetated land with active transpiration rarely gets above 20 degrees centigrade. And if you're basically keeping your soil cooler, by definition, physics, you're going to re-radiate far, far less heat up into the air. And so instead of creating these high pressure heat domes, then you are actually having areas of cool, low pressure zones above these areas. Now, this is where the dividend is, you see, because basically the water evaporated from the oceans is, again, low pressure air. Okay, it's at lower pressure. And there is no way that low pressure air can muscle in and flow into these areas protected by high pressure heat domes. Okay, but they can flow into the actual cooler low pressure areas, the valleys, what have you, etc., created by these green landscapes. And so you have this biotic pump effect, whereby the evaporation from the ocean will flow preferentially into areas that have already been green and vegetated and cooler, because they've got low pressure heat zones or low pressure zones over them, compared to these aridified, dry, desertified areas which have got these blocking high pressure domes. So really, once you aridify land, you intensify its aridification because you block these monsoonal airflows. Now, the monsoons all over the planet, whether it's, and again, we know the Indian monsoon, it's, same applies there, but obviously it still falls as rain because of the Himalayas. But we used to have monsoons in Australia, in Saudi Arabia, in the African Sahel. Basically, we had these monsoonal airflows, but by having aridified these lands, we are now actually blocking their capacity for moist, cool monsoonal air to flow into them. And so really, we've got this enormous opportunity by regreening landscapes, can we restore the monsoons? Now, obviously, this is at a continental scale and it needs to be looked at in a longer time frame, but certainly the evidence is yes, we can, and that we've got quite a bit of evidence where we have basically reforested, valleys and zones. We'll get preferential humid airflows into those zones compared to adjacent valleys which have been desiccated and basically have these high pressure blocking heat domes over them. So again, here's a whole dynamic of rehydrating arid landscapes through the wise management of the vegetation on those landscapes. I think this will probably be getting now detailed enough, but we've got the other thing, of course, moisture normally comes from rainfall, right? We always say, look, the 100 drops, again, we're relying on 100 drops. But whether we get a raindrop is actually something that, again, we govern through our land management, okay? Because this is a bit complicated, but it's absolutely clear physics. The water is obviously in the soil and it gets transpired and evaporated as water vapor, as a gas. And of course, it goes up into the air. And when it gets into the air, it has to condense. But then it can only condense if it's nucleated, right? It needs actually particles to nucleate on. And the type of particle has a critical effect whether it will form humid hazes. So if it forms on very small dust, dimethyl sulfide, aerosols, carbon pollutions, particulates, basically it will form these humid hazes or these smogs, right? And you'll get these high humidity, perpetual humid heat haze smogs. And of course, you get that over California, etc. It's so renowned. That's in a sense your high humidity smogs, right? So it's 80% humidity plus, but basically it never rains because you've got persistent humid haze smogs over them. And why? Because all these dust particles or these nuclei form very, very small haze microdroplets. And so you get very, very small haze microdroplets. These are negatively charged. They repel each other. So you end up with the water in the air in these haze microdroplets. Trillions and trillions of them. And of course, it's basically in there, but it can never precipitate because these are repelling each other and they stay there suspended as these persistent haze microdroplets. And of course, that again is what we're seeing throughout a lot of arid areas. So in the Middle East now, we've got this summer humid haze, dangerous heat levels because you're ending up with temperatures over 45 degrees centigrade, humidity's over 80%, and quite frankly, you've got conditions that are now no longer sustainable for human physiology. So if you're not in air conditioning, you're effectively dying of heat stress in that environment because it's way beyond our capacity to cool ourselves physiologically. And so we've got vast areas of the planet that are now subject to this humid haze. In summer, all the way from Cairo to Beijing, you've got the Asian brown haze, and it's sitting over that whole big arc of regions, just sitting there as a humid, toxic haze. And it's basically heating, but it's also aridifying because it won't basically dry out. And of course, this is a natural phenomena, but of course, nature balanced these humid hazes with another process, and these are hygroscopic precipitation nuclei. Okay, and rather than having these haze nuclei, nature also produces these hygroscopic precipitation. Hygroscopic means that they can suck in moisture, and basically they then form clouds. And basically by producing these hygroscopic precipitation nuclei, these clouds can coalesce millions of these little haze micro droplets and make cloud droplets. And cloud droplets then, of course, much, much larger. And of course, these cloud droplets then, of course, form clouds. And of course, these clouds, instead of heating the planet, very rapidly lead to the actual cooling of the planet because they reflect incident solar radiation directly back out to space. Okay, and so these hygroscopic precipitation nuclei are critically important for turning this heating, drying environment into this cooling environment. Okay, and so nature actually has managed the climate very nicely by this balance of its production of either haze nuclei or these hygroscopic precipitation nuclei. We'll take it one step further. These same hygroscopic precipitation nuclei then keep on coalescing these cloud droplets to form rain droplets that are large and heavy enough to fall out under gravity. Of course, that's what our rain is. And of course, that's what recharges the soil sponge, the soil water. So again, it'll take about 1 million of these cloud droplets into a raindrop that's big enough, heavy enough to fall out under gravity to move that water from the air. And so basically we've got, again, nature providing the whole hydrological, but also the whole big part of the climate dynamics through its production of 2 different types of nuclei. And it's a balance between these that really governs these processes. And whereas these are all actually accelerated by aridification, right? When you think we've got a dry, desertified landscape that's eroding, yes, we're putting up massive quantities of dust. Every year now, there's some 5 billion tons of soil, clay particles dispersed as dust going into the air. I mean, you'll see those dust clouds from the Sahara going right across the Atlantic Ocean and, of course, nucleating hazes in the Caribbean. Okay, so there's a massive production, of course, most of our carbon pollution, like the aerosols from polyaromatic hydrocarbons and particulate carbon pollution from burning fossil fuel. We're putting another about 2 billion tons of carbon particulates into this haze nucleation process as well through our fossil fuel use. By contrast, these hygroscopic precipitation nuclei, they're formed naturally. And there's three key components, 3 things that actually end up as hygroscopic precipitation nuclei. The first, of course, are ice crystals. And you know that when you've got ice, it's hygroscopic. It'll absorb more water. Certain salts, and of course, that's what the seas, ocean clouds are all about. Salts coming up from the sea spray, creating ocean clouds, but of course also over land. And of course, this is what we use when we use basic cloud seeding studies, where you use silver iodide and dry ice and other compounds to actually act as hygroscopic precipitation nuclei to try and make raindrops to get more water out of the air. But nature, of course, doesn't have to put, it uses ice, it uses all of these, but what nature does, particularly in tropical areas, forested areas that are too warm for these ice crystals and far away from the sea for the salt, is actually it generates hygroscopic bacteria. And these are produced from the stomatal cavity of forests, the leaves in forests, and they go up in the transpiration stream and more or less rapidly turn that water vapor that's condensed into clouds and back into rain. And so in the Amazon forest, for example, you'll have transpiration in the morning, right through midday, early afternoon, going up, up, up. But 4:30 in the afternoon, it's a tropical rainforest, and these bacteria that have been actually emitted and transpired as part of this transpiration have already formed dense cumulus clouds. And so at 4:30, we've got this cumulus rainstorm, and all that water that was transpired during the morning is now coming back down to earth. And so basically the Amazon basin generates its own rainfall through these hygroscopic nucleation processes. The rainfall in the Amazon basin is 5 to 7 times greater than the outflow of the Amazon River into the Atlantic Ocean, which is meaning that basically every molecule of water that comes in gets cycled at least 7 times through this process as it moves across from the Atlantic to the Andes. So basically what we're now seeing, of course, is this powerful process whereby, in fact, it is biology, it is forests, it is nature that is generating its own rainfall. Okay? And it does that through these nucleation processes. And obviously, as we've cleared our forests, we are losing a lot of this nucleation capacity. And we've seen that before. As we create a desertified landscape, or we end up with these haze nuclei, we don't have these cloud formation nuclei, we don't have the rain forming nuclei, and we end up reinforcing aridity. Okay, so really this is again a powerful sort of natural biological driver. And again, we've got lots of studies, case studies around the world where basically, yes, we can destroy forests, we can reduce this natural hydrological nucleation processes and turn that landscape into deserts, but vice versa, by regenerating forests that actually are producing these processes, we can actually turn those aridified areas back into productive landscapes.
Okay,
So look,
but
what
Walter,
I've been trying to sort of say here is actually, sorry,
so
Michael, did you say anything?
Yeah, we have 20 minutes left now. We've done hour and 10.
Okay, I was, yep.
So
good.
I don't know how much
just
you
basically
wanted to
coming
get
close.
through, but I know you said you wanted time for questions and answers, so just giving you a heads up.
Yeah, no. Yeah, look, and I'm going through it quickly because I just wanted to come now in 3 minutes to the question you said, how do we build that soil carbon sponge,
The
right?
solutions.
Right back to Michael's point. And the answer is, of course, we do it just as nature did. And this is in a sense as simple as A, B, C, right? And basically it's all about A. It's all about nature or agriculture or photosynthesis. And the whole point line is we've got to maximize photosynthesis because that is fixing CO2 from the air and turning it into biomass under photosynthesis, right? So that's the first part. A, we've got to actually maximize plant growth on this planet because we need that to draw carbon out of the air, but also we need it as a building block for the sponge. But the key thing is what happens to that carbon that we fix, because we can only do 2 things to it. All through the whole of evolution on this planet, only 2 things have happened to every molecule of carbon that's ever been fixed by plants. It can either burn or oxidize back to CO2, and we can do that by creating oxidative processes in our land management, burning, cultivation, over-fertilizing, biocides, bare fallowing. And if we do that, we can more or less get all of A, the 100% of A, back up into the air, and we can do that very rapidly. Conversely, we can do C. We can actually take this biomass fixed by A, and we can turn it into stable soil carbon. Okay, and we can do that really quite simply and naturally by fungi. And these are fungi that turn this organic matter, break it down, biodegrade it, and turn it into humus, or otherwise organic matter that's actually produced already as exudates, and again by fungi turning it into this other compound, glomalin. But these are then stable soil carbon compounds that last for 100 to 1,000 years in the soil. And so the issue is the ratio of B to C, like it's maximizing A, but then how much of that A do we burn and how much do we put into the soil as stable soil carbon? And nature's giving us a clue already because 30% of the photosynthesate it produces, it puts into the shoots above the ground, but 70% of it is actually invested in the roots, 30%, and then 40% in the root exudates. And so 70% of the carbon from A is already going down under. So we have this capacity to say, look, we can grow plants, and as long as we optimize, maximize how much is going down under as stable soil carbon, rather than being oxidized through these industrial processes, we can build soil carbon sponges rapidly. We can do up to 10 tons carbon per hectare per annum through this BC ratio management. So it's a simple matter of doing less of this oxidative, more on agriculture, and going back to these natural fungal-based biosequestration processes. Now, we don't need to use all 100% of A, but if we can get 70% of A into C rather than to B, we're really building soil carbon. The powerful effect of this, we've already talked about it though, for every gram of carbon we put into C, we get dividends. We get these force multipliers, whether it's in the water retention, the nutrient availability, the root proliferation, the microbial cycling, the disease resistance. And it's this that actually governs productivity and resilience in biosystems. And it's very simple that nature used D to ever increase the productivity of its biosystems, right? It's by building the sponge and getting these dividends, because these are all the limiting factors that are now overcome by D. And that allows biosystems to become ever more productive in nature. So we start off with a desert, arid scrub, and then we move it all the way into a productive forest, because D is building water, nutrients, rootability, disease resistance, etc. The other powerful thing is if we've got D happening, we don't need any of those factors in B. So the 21st century is all about how do we redesign agriculture so it's being driven by these dividends, by the sponge, rather than driven by this moron inputs, which are just oxidizing and creating our process. So the punchline is, look, you guys in the front line, permaculture, it's all about regenerating the soil carbon sponge, because that, as we said in those initial diagrams, is giving you all those key elements, overcoming these limiting factors to give you ever more productive biosystems. And of course, allows you to avoid these oxidative destructive systems there. So look, that's where I'd like to sort of leave it and really say, you guys in permaculture, I mean, these are the tools you've got. Here are some of the other tools in rehydrating landscapes, managing water in arid areas. But it's your wisdom, it's your observation, it's your practical experience in applying these tools, and with that, regreening, rehydrating the planet. So thank you very much, and I'll switch this around, and we can now have Q&A.
All right. Vast applause. Hey, so we're going to start off the
Right.
question
Were
and
there
answer.
any sort of difficult questions or?
Oh, I have so many questions, but I'm going to start with, since I'm in front of the camera, I'm going to ask one question, and then we're going to have various people come forward here. But my question is, when you get into dryland systems, I think I always had this idea that fungi were like a forest species and that they didn't go that far into the drylands. And so my question is how and to what kind of dry situations can fungi be be it present in? I am assuming that a lot of them are out of the soil because of the soil's built up. But at what point can we introduce fungi into the soil? Will they just show up on their own? Is inoculation useful?
Yeah.
So how do we get fungi in dryland systems?
Well, look, okay, the fungi are already in dryland systems. They're there naturally. It's quite the other way around. That basically, as we said in petagenesis, it's the fungi that come first. And it's the fungi, then they say, look, I need sugars because I can't make photosynthesis myself. So they basically came along and sort of said, look, I see these algae, can you come and join me and we'll make a lichen? Okay, and so when you go to desert, what is it? It's lichens. It's all those really tough, arid things. Well, they're fungi with basically not, I won't say freeloaders, but they've got their algae. So the lichen is an algal fungal symbiosis, and that's the pioneer, really hard-ass pioneer making it possible. So now all your deserts are full of fungi, but they don't appear the same way as you would in a mushroom, like forests in the northeast, for example, because they're just operating underground and they're operating through these hyphae, these 25,000 kilometers of fungal hyphae interfacing underground. They can also exist, you see, this is important, as we tried to show there, they can exist at water tensions 10 times higher than plants can, right? Because they can exist on taking water from water films, taking water from the air. See, the lichens, they can persist for 100 years, and then when there's water, they'll rehydrate and start growing again. So, look, they are there. Now, as far as reintroducing them, certainly when we disturb a soil, when we, again, more on agriculture, we over-fertilize, biocides, we can kill them. And so then we've got to look at each situation and say, right, well, what's residual here? We've got bioassays that we can assess that, but then we can reintroduce them with plants because they always need their plant to provide them with a sugar. But we can then, and this is what successional pioneer regenerative strategies do, we start off with those pioneer plants with their fungi and then progressively accelerate ever more fungi, ever more plant successions.
Wow. Okay. Well, next we'll just have somebody sit in front of you here. I'm going to move off to the side.
Mike. Hello. That was super inspiring and dense. Thank you so much. I was just at the last slide. I was thinking about the notion of chop and drop. It's a very common practice. And
right. Yep.
Yeah. What can you say to that?
Okay, look, very good. Thank you. Very intelligent question. Yeah, if you chop and drop and you leave it on the surface, then a lot of that organic matter is actually going to be broken down by saprophytic organisms, and a lot of it will go to CO2, right? Because it's not incorporating in the soil. Some of it will, but basically 80% of it will go into CO2 if you just chop and drop. But better than that is, and this is what nature's evolved, again, exquisitely, if you basically have mobile biodigesters, we call them herbivores, and if you eat the stuff, right, and then you basically break it down because you've got the rumen or you've got the gut, and it's a really wonderful environment, it's breaking it down, and then you're adding stable soil carbon and biofertilizer, so you're converting all that chop and drop into, biofertilizers and stable soil carbon, then you can get 50% of the biomass into, or 50% of the A into C, right? Whereas just chop and drop, you might only get 20% in. Now, but depends. Once you build a good deep mulch layer with active rotting, then it's again a little bit better. But what's happened is we've had this big move into zero tillage, where we've got then stubble on the surface, this is in grain production, and a lot of that stubble doesn't break down because it's just sitting on the surface. It's too dry. It's not in connection with the soil, and therefore most of it with time will just go into CO2. Okay, so it's a question of, yes, you've got biomass, and it's a question of what percentage of it do I get into the soil? Herbivores help that. If you've got deeper, mulchy, moister, composting layers, compost heaps, of course, help it enormously. But if it's just loose and dry on the surface, it's valuable as a mulch, as a protective mulch. But most of that mulch, 80% of the mulch will still be over time going into CO2.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us. Here in the Pacific forests, we have an overabundance of forest biomass, and it tends to be younger trees because the older trees have all been removed. And so there's a movement afoot to create biochar from the thinning projects. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about biochar versus just mulching or using that mass for other things, because when it burns in a forest fire, it's pretty problematic.
Yeah. Look, we've got another massive topic here, which is very important, because like Australia, California is burning. And so this whole question of fire versus fungi, right? So again, natural balance, do we oxidize or do we biodegrade, B or C, right? Now, what we can do, and certainly in the Amazon, they did that very well, that they made the terra preta soils through a biochar process. But you got to really look at it carefully, because you got to ask yourself, well, what is the embodied energy in cutting, harvesting, pyrolysis, making the biochar, transporting it, and then how do you put it back into the soil? What are the actual ecological and economic costs of all that? So, you've got to really do a life cycle analysis on it very, very carefully and work out what's actually beneficial. The question but you have a major problem. There's no question. See, what's happened is that you don't have the fungal activity in your forests that you used to have to actually drive that fungal, in situ fungal biodegradation at the levels that it needs to be or was. And that's partly because we've actually changed the whole ecology of those forests. They're drier. We don't have the herbivores. The carbon-nitrogen ratio in those forests has changed. And so this is all a challenge of, okay, how do we actually re-accelerate or re-stimulate actually carbon fungal rot down in those forests? So most of the fuel doesn't have to be turned into biochar, but it can be, in a sense, biodegraded in situ in the forest as it did previously. Does that help to explain? Or
Well, I'm just wondering if you could, speak a little bit to the ratio maybe of like, how would you measure how much biomass you should be treating in one way or the other?
Yeah, look, okay, it's a bit like, obviously there's no simple prescription, but you got to look at a situation and say, look, okay, I'm accumulating 5 tons of biomass per hectare per annum here, right, as dry litter, and that's going to be fire fuel, disaster. And so then you have to say, well, what's limiting its breakdown? And actually, a classic case, you guys in California, okay, 150 years ago, you found these eucalypts in Australia. You came over for the gold rush. You found these eucalypts. You took all these eucalypt seeds to California, and you've been growing eucalypts, right? But you never brought any of the fungi from Australia across to America. So now you've got eucalypts producing, 5 tons of fuel per hectare per annum, but you don't have any breakdown of this eucalypt litter because your fungi can't manage it, right? And so you're getting this inferno every 3 years, because by that stage you've got 20 tons of litter on the ground, and you're in a wildfire. And so it's a question of, have I got the organisms? What's their activity? And how do I increase the activity of those fungal breakdown organisms? Now, in your natural forest, the organisms are still there, but their activity is probably working at 10, 15% of what they should be. Then you've got to look at what's limiting that. One of the big factors there is carbon-nitrogen ratios. For the fungi to break down this litter, there's got to be enough nitrogen, about 30-1. And there's things like your wildlife, right? You used to have salmon coming up the rivers. The bears would hunt the salmon, they would excrete the salmon, and all that nitrogen from the bears and what have you would then be fertilized. That was all high nitrogen fertilizers. So you've probably lost about 3/4 of the nitrogen, natural organic nitrogen input into those forests because of changes in herbivore management, right? But these are the sort of things you'd have to look at, and then you say, right, I've got to restore the active accelerated breakdown of that litter. And I mean, I haven't got what I'm saying. I can't give you a formula. Well, the formula is roughly you've got to be 20 to 30 to 1 carbon to nitrogen, but your forest at the moment is probably running 100 to 1 carbon to nitrogen, right, in terms of what's in the litter. And so by definition, it's only running at 10% of what it could be or should be.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
So it's really managing that microbial. It's like the compost heap. It's managing you've got a broad acre in situ compost heap, and you've got to try and manage the optimum carbon nitrogen ratio and activity and see what's stopping it and what can you do to enhance it. There are biostimulants. Okay, the fungi basically can be stimulated to increase their activity tenfold. But again, you've got to look at that in that situation to say, right, what's the effect of these biostimulants vis-a-vis carbon, nitrogen, those sorts of factors. So look, I'm sorry, there's no simple textbook, and this is the trouble with biology or, microbial ecology particularly. It's a matter of, and this is where you are with permaculture, it's a matter of observing, looking, where's it working, where isn't it working, what are the differences in the factors, how do I change those factors?
Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
I know there's a huge book written on mycorrhizal symbiosis, and I know that I would have access to certain species of mycorrhizal fungi if I wanted to leverage my plantings with them. But say this group, where would we go to get species of mycorrhizal fungi to help us leverage our plantings to restore things?
Okay, look, thank you very much. And look, it's a lot easier than that. 98% of plants in nature are obligate mycorrhizal, right? They need these mycorrhizal because they can't compete without it. So if you go to most natural habitats, you'll still have these natural fungi. You won't see them because you only see what's above the ground, the basidiomycetes that produce mushrooms, right? But they'll be there. And so it's a question then of taking natural soil, and then when you're growing seedlings, letting those fungi from that natural soil inoculate and infect your seedlings and form those, and then you plant those out. You can actually look at them microscopically. You can then look at, yes, these roots have got these fungal symbionts growing from them. But in doing that, you kill them, of course. So you don't want to look at everything. You just take a sample. But the point is that, yes, you can do that. And then it comes to, like, the next question. Yes, 95% of the time, I've got the mycorrhizae there. And then the question is, what's limiting their activity? And so this comes then into what are the conditions to stimulate? And I'm sorry, again, there's no magic formula, switch on and off, but it's that balance between, every organism needs, obviously, the germplasm, the DNA. It needs its substrate, its food, its sugars, so it's the amount of root exudates. And it needs a conducive environment, right? And it's that combination. Yes, you've got germplasm. Have you got enough root exudates? Sometimes it's cover cropping or other things giving it extra exudate oomph. And then thirdly, is the environment suitable, things like the carbon, nitrogen, etc. And then it's really grassroots observation, and looking at what's working. And then where you're getting problems. Often you can actually look at the problems and saying, hang on, this isn't working here. And that'll give you a clue to what's limiting or what could be, negative, causing problems.
Thank you.
But yeah, as you say, it's a big textbook, and we're describing them, but it's honestly, we must say too that nature's way ahead of us. She's far cleverer than we are. and we're just still in the kindergarten stuff, learning a lot of the details of this, right? Very good.
Well, I think maybe we're down to, time for one more question here, Walter, but no one was standing in line. So I have a question for you that's come up during this course for me is what is the latitude or is it the longitude, the latitude, the line on the earth for like where the termites are the most, really the important breakdown agents, and where are the worms? Is there a line between like there's worms to toward the north or toward the higher latitudes and then the termites are in the middle? And where are ants all everywhere, or are ants limited? Ants, worms.
Very good, Michael. Yeah, no, look, very good. And look, this is powerful. And of course, there's no simple latitude, your north-south sort of thing. But no, you've really got to look at dryness, right? It's a question of, and this comes back to the previous question of environmental ecology. If it gets too dry, then basically free living in situ organisms are struggling. It's getting, hasn't got enough moisture. So then they have to revert back to saying, okay, I've got, as we said, these mobile biodigesters, the herbivores, right? Because then I've got the right environment in a room and in a gut, and I can walk across a dry landscape, but the composting system is in my gut and it can't be in the paddock. Then you say, look, I've got to switch the herbivore this time not into a mobile biodigester, but into a static biodigester, which is, of course, your termite mound. And the termite mound is then maintained at a moisture and a temperature optimum for biodegradation, right? It doesn't move around, of course. The termites do. But the point is that it's when you get to what level of dryness, okay? And also what level of carbon-nitrogen ratio, because the termites in an area is where it's basically cardboard, it's straw, it's lignin. There's very, very little nitrogen. And they've got that advantage because they've got algae in their guts, so they don't need the nitrogen from the substrate. They're producing their own nitrogen from the algae in their guts. And so that's why they can digest this cardboard or your house, right? The timber in your house, when there's no nitrogen, right? So, it's not latitude, but definitely there's ecological zones. As far as ants, they're a little bit different because they're a higher order animal and they're carnivores and they're living off the other organisms, right? So, they'll be harvesting and cycling other organisms, cleaning them all up. So, they're really a laundry of all this biota. If you want to come at food chains and this is powerful again, you go back petagenesis, and the initial food chain are the fungi, right? Because they're producing these very high protein, high quality, high full, biomass out of basically CO2 and a bit of nitrogen, a bit of water. So they're really the primary food source. And most of the other soil biota, your worms and your nematodes, are living off the fungi or other organisms that were living off the fungi, right? So they're all eating each other. But the primary driver of that food is a high quality, high full mat. So, for example, a worm is living off eating soil, but it's not eating the soil. It's eating all the microbes of fungi that are growing on that soil, and then it's excreting humus and soil particles in its castings from having eaten all those fungi. Okay, so basically every one of these organisms has a key role, but it depends on where and when and under what circumstances. And of course, we don't have to specify them, but we just create the opportunity, the diversity for all of them to function in their synergistic communities, combined. So, and you'll find as things improve, then you create conditions where the termites are no longer competitive, right? Because you've improved legume levels in those drylands, arid pastures. there's now enough nitrogen, and so then other things come in and will replace the termites.
Well, that's great. Well, Walter, you've really helped open our eyes, and so it just makes me want to watch all of your videos. So there's folks, I must say, do you have a probably have a website with lots of stuff?
Yes, okay, we do. Look, we work through a little group, an NGO called Regenerate Earth. So if you go onto the web, regenerate-earth, there's a website. And then basically on that, there's a whole lot of videos and what have you. It's fair comment to say there's lots of work. We've still got to stack the shelves in a way that it's not all, like we're continually updating the website and what have you. But yeah, look, certainly Regenerate Earth. And then, and then there's lots of YouTubes and videos. A lot of my stuff, actually, we haven't got into now, has been talking about naturally hydrologically cooling the climate, right? But that all comes from the sponge and hydrology. But that's another story. It goes on and on. There's so many avenues in this wonderful world down under.
I know it never ends. And so we have one more burning question. We're going to, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please. No, I've got plenty of time. No.
Oh, good. Thank you. I have a question. If you were to have a dryland piece of property that's been overgrazed, compacted, 5 acres or so, what types of strategies would you personally take, successional strategies to sort of speed up the process?
No, look, thank you very much. And that's exactly the game we're in. I mean, that's exactly what Regenerate Earth does, except we're not looking at an acre. We're saying we as humanity over the next 10 years have to really bite the bullet and turn 1 billion hectares of arid wasteland back into green, rehydrated biosystems, right? But obviously that billion breaks down to every square meter helps, right? So can we catalyze people like yourselves everywhere? And the first thing is just humbly going there and look and listen and understand what's happening in this system naturally, right? Nature's already there trying to do things. And so it's a case of, well, what is happening? What stage is it at? What are the processes? And then, can I accelerate and enhance and stimulate those processes? But look, very much starting point is physically, how do I actually stop that soil desiccating, heating, baking, re-radiating? So, here's a bit of mulch. How do I start building the sponge? So that's ABC sort of stuff, right? Because then I can get more of the 100 raindrops retained in that water, in that soil. And then basically coming on to some of those other questions to say, right, how do I enhance the ABC process through microbial, ecology? What's limiting what we talked about, fire versus fungi? What's limiting the activity of these fungi in these processes, right? Very quickly, you bring in herbivores, but not overgrazing, very careful, because they're extremely effective cycling organisms, right? Because those herbivores can come in. Now, you don't have to have them in your garden, but then you're saying, okay, I'm taking this green waste and I'm actually feeding that to an animal, and then I'm using that excreta back again. So nature, these herbivores and excreta were very powerful biostimulants to these systems, right? So, I mean, that's it. And if you're in a garden, and this is why I showed you the wicking bag thing, if you're in a garden, and especially if you're in a small community or individual and you've got to feed yourself, which we all do, then I really suggest looking at these wicking bags, because a wicking bag is, in a sense, an Earth system microcosm, right? You're really saying, okay, here is a cubic meter of soil or half a cubic meter of soil, and I'm managing the water, the nutrients, the cycling, and I can accelerate that. And the powerful thing is, look, if every child on this planet could have 1 or 2 wicking bags, we could grow enough food from those wicking bags to feed those children. The children could feed themselves, right? So from 5-year-old to 12-year-old, if they each had a couple of wicking bags, there'd be enough productivity there to meet their nutritious food needs, independence, autonomy, and get them into regenerating soil. And of course, then from the wicking bag, then there's an acre, then there's a hectare, then it goes bigger and bigger. A big issue is actually empowering ourselves with the knowledge to say, one, yes, we can, yes, it's that simple. This is how nature did it. But then giving us also the permaculture tools, the sort of things I rushed through, tried to talk about. Here are tools that we can use to do that journey, but really saying that you are the solution. You're standing on the solution. It's your soil, but it's actually up to each of us to say, all right, how do we rebuild these productive biosystems for securing our future?
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Well, we'll bid you adieu for now, Walter, but I'll make sure that every time I put on one of these dryland things again, we invite you to take part. And I know you're doing a lot of work with Elaine Ingham these days. I saw you on with Zach Weiss the other day. He's going to be joining us too. So
Good, yeah.
Yeah, we're running in the same circles here.
Yeah, and look, and certainly as we were just saying then, it's also coming down practically. Okay, where are there sites? Where are there areas that are people working on, and then brainstorming and working. Okay, how do I turn this land around? Because we've given you a lot of the tools, but then the real issue is, right, how do I use those tools in what situations, for example, right?
Okay, well, we've everybody's got a big job to do, and but I like the 1 billion hectare challenge there. It's kind of like the 100-mile diet or something. So, hey, well, you take good care there, Walter. Down under.
Okay, and thank you very much, Michael, and thank you everybody, and all the best. And then let's just take our permaculture manuals and go to bed and read them, right? Okay,
That's
all
right.
the very best. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.